We are on to our final presentation, which is pretty awesome. Chris Gallello. Chris runs a VR meetup group called Room Scale, and he does all this really cool. He makes VR games, but he also is the founder of Purple, which is a design process tool that allows you to visualize the entire process from top to bottom. He's a genius when it comes to design process. He gave a talk back in October when we had a UX and VR series about the VR design process. And now he's going to talk about ways to collaborate and integrate your team into your design process and how to document everything and inspire everybody to do a great job. So give it up for Chris, and thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Alrighty, I'm going to be sitting. I can't stand for too long at once, so bear with me. Thank you for that. So everything that I do kind of stems from a frustration. And the reason I want to talk to you about why it's important to integrate your team into the design process, not just your designers, but everybody else, comes from frustration. I've seen it not work before, and then I've seen it work. So I want to kind of share the things that I've learned along the way in doing that. Before I get too deep, I just want to give you a quick background. I used to work at Microsoft. I was on the accessibility side in the Office division. I also worked on Office Online, so Word Online, Excel Online. On the side, I built a tool called UX Check, which allows you to run a heuristic evaluation on a live website. I released that for free, and it did pretty well, and that was kind of inspiration for me to say, oh, I kind of like building design tools, so I think I might do that one day. And then I also joined Imager as their first product manager, and I was kind of heads on fire there all the time and working across all their products, so that was very fun. Andy kind of explained a high level of what Purple is. So at the high level, we allow you to bring your whole design process into one place. So when you start your design process, it kind of starts off innocent, where you have some things that you have to do. Maybe let's say you have to do a usability test to start off this project. You have to make sure that you find participants and put together questions, all that kind of stuff. But then, all right, you do the usability tests, and now you actually need to synthesize everything and explain what you learned to everybody else on your team. So then there's all these other tools that you as designers all know how to do, is empathy maps and user journeys, that kind of stuff. So it's starting to get a little bit trickier. And then you actually need to create the designs. You need to wireframe and prototype and create all these animations. And it gets really, really complicated and messy. And obviously, for every type of project, you're going to have a different process that you're going to have to follow. And so it's so important for you as a designer not to kind of just leave it up to like, oh, I'm going to navigate my way through this process and kind of go in circles, but actually plan it out. And also make sure that your team understands what the hell you're doing. On top of that, it gets really tricky because your job as a designer is to come up with the simplest designs possible for your users, in almost all cases, hopefully. However, that means that all the hard work that you do ahead of time isn't really seen by everybody else in the company. There's actually a lot of important work that you're doing, but at the end of the day, your designs look super simple, and everybody's like, what are they doing? And so that makes design a very, very deceptive practice. So you actually need to be proactive about this whole process. And that's kind of those two things, that's what I want to talk about. How do you actually be proactive about making sure that everybody understands what is it you're doing? So I want to go through three things. The first is about how to involve your team in your process. Again, beyond just the designers around you, maybe even just the product managers around you, really everybody. I also want to talk about how do you make sure that your work is accessible by everybody else, and also how do you do this process of evangelizing what you do. All right. So when you're doing a project, you're generally going to be having to work with a bunch of different types of people eventually, but they all have their own priorities. They're all looking the other direction. They're not caring about you. So you actually need to be very explicit with them occasionally and say, hey, I know you might be interested in this project, and so I would love to loop you in, for example, into the user research process. I would love for you to be able to have the same insights that I do directly from our users, and that can be very, very helpful. Or for brainstorming, looping in your actual engineers and QA and say, hey, you're going to be the one building this. You should also chip in ideas, right? That's important. And then finally, for design reviews, it's important to give everybody an opportunity to have a say in what you're doing. So just kind of a quick story about this. I worked on accessibility at Microsoft for maybe half my time. And there was a conference down in San Diego that I used to go to. And it was kind of the biggest accessibility technology conference down there. And rather than just me going, I brought my software tester. So like software testers are generally not the ones who are like, being the face of the company and talking to users directly. But he was a really passionate guy about accessibility. And so, hey, I realized it would be very helpful to have him here because first of all, it actually draws him in. And second of all, if he's talking to our end users down here about how these users are using our products when they're blind or they have vision impairments, that kind of stuff, then it'll be helpful because then he knows how to test the software. So at the end of the day, people really like design. Like even people who are not designers actually like design. They just didn't go to school for it, or they didn't happen to fall into that track. And so when you identify people who are like that, again, it's many, loop them in, bring them into the process, and make them feel like they're really part of it. Hold their hand throughout it. All right. Another thing that I would do when I was at Imager, whenever I would start a project, I would send out an email to the whole company and say, hey, we're starting a new project. Here are the stakeholders on the project. Here are the people who are involved. Here's our user goals. Here's our scenarios. And here are just some ideas that we have of feature directions for this. It's not concrete, but here's a start. And on top of that, I would put, hey, this project is starting. And if you have a strong opinion on this feature, or if you can contribute, please email us. So this, again, opens the doors for people to be able to participate in the design process. And it's up to you to make sure that you're not really depending on everybody else. You should still be leading this process. But at the end of the day, again, it's very helpful to have outside opinions. So there were multiple projects where we would bring in engineers and marketing, that kind of stuff, into our process and make sure that they had a say. Because especially with a company like Imager, Imager is very, very deep nerd culture. And so you end up getting people with very strong opinions because everybody at the company is a user. And so it was important for us to make sure we listen to the whole company. All right. So the next thing is about making your work accessible. And Carola kind of hinted to this, so that was pretty helpful. Thank you. So I worked with a user researcher at Microsoft who was fantastic at her job. She was really able to draw amazing insights out of users and user interview them very well, that kind of stuff. The problem is that she would put all of these great insights into a PowerPoint deck, and then she would present it to us, email it to us, and make sure that it's in her OneDrive that we could access. And that's great. However, okay, let's say I'm creating a feature and I need to use those insights. I now need to dig for that information. I got to look through my email, and if I type in usability testing report, there's a million things, and I don't know where her folder is in OneDrive, so I got to poke around. So if it's not immediately accessible, I'm not really going to use it. I'm just going to say, oh, I think I remember that. So you're really actually wasting time and money, and that's a problem. So what you need to make sure that you do is, in terms of accessibility of information, what that really means is make sure that other people can find your work and make sure that people can understand your work without even being there. So one way I've done this, kind of making sure people can find my work, for one design project that I was working on, we had a studio set up. We had walls and put stuff up on the walls. But one of the big center walls was we put up a big piece of butcher paper and wrote gold nuggets at the top. Anytime anybody on the design team had an insight about our users, whether it was an insight that the whole team had or even just, hey, they didn't even realize that and they've changed their views on how our users behave, that was worth putting up on the wall. We try to keep the barrier for entry of putting something up there very low to encourage participation. So not only did it encourage participation, inclusivity, bringing people into the process, but it also made it very, very easy for everybody to immediately reference our insights that we've had and the insights you've worked so hard to actually pull out of your process. Another thing that I've done here is, I'll skip that one. So understanding your work is another tricky thing, especially if you work at a company where you're doing, healthcare, for example, or productivity tools where there's deep, deep language that specific language about how you talk about your features and your users, that kind of stuff. One thing that I do is at the top of my design documentation, I just put a terminology thing at the top. hey, here are the words that we're going to be using over and over and over throughout this spec or throughout this design documentation. So for example, like card bottom padding, like if I didn't define that up at the top, every time I use that terminology over and over, they would just be lost and they would kind of skip over it, gloss over it, and start ignoring it. Another example of this was I was at Imager, and I don't know if you guys have seen this famous Slack released their notifications diagram showing how notifications are mapped out and all the logic behind it. It's very complex. So I did the same thing when I was at Imager. I think it took me 3 iterations to get to a point where people could actually understand it, but I'm really glad I did because I left maybe 2-3 years ago, and apparently they still use that base spreadsheet that I built with kind of, that was validation to me, like, hey, I designed that well enough and I iterated on that well enough. So people could understand it without me even being there. All right, so the last thing is about evangelizing your work. So when I started Purple, my engineering team came up to me and they were like, we don't really, we like the direction that we're heading in, but we don't really fully understand the details of the design process. So can you explain that to me? And I said, okay, I need to teach you guys. So what I did was I started by just showing old design projects of mine, all the nitty-gritty stuff that people don't see, the user research videos, the persona posters that we put together, the permission forms to make sure we have your video recording permission. All that kind of stuff is actually really helpful for everyone to see. In fact, at the end of that, one of my engineers came up to me and he was like, hey, Chris, thank you so much for showing us that, because up until this point, I kind of thought design was a little wishy-washy and there wasn't much going on in design, but now I understand that there's actually a lot of detail and process that goes into it. So in addition, I also put together presentations, basically bi-weekly presentations on different topics on design. I would spend maybe an hour every 2 weeks putting together a presentation and 10 minutes presenting it to the team. And again, that was also very helpful to show how much detail goes into it. And it also helps them understand when it comes time to actually develop the product, how we got there. And so they know which parts of it are important and which parts they may be able to have a little bit more of a say on. All right, so if we're going to put this all together, I figured it'd be fun to see kind of a very recent project that I'm working on and kind of show you the process that we follow. So actually, first I'm going to show you a feature template. Obviously, this is all, we do our work in Purple. So let's see. How do we find that? Chrome. There we go. All right. So go away. Okay, there we go. All right, so again, Purple is just really all about being able to lay out your design process all together, plan out your project, bring all your designs in, prototypes in, that kind of stuff. That's why you see these a bunch of different cards that are side by side. And so this feature template is what we use for the Purple team to make sure that we're not forgetting any part of our process. So we start with reviews. We then have a product section where we lay out all the different details of the design process and the actual designs, sometimes prototypes, the spec. We then have an engineering planning section, a testing section, and then a release section. So at a high level, that's how we break up our general process. I'll then kind of actually show you a real project. So this project, again, I think it's always fun to show very, very recent stuff. So this is something that's not shipped yet. This is Google Drive importing, and this basically allows you to import multiple Google Docs at once just by selecting a Google Drive folder. So right now you can actually embed Google Docs like this one over here on the right. That's a live embedded Google Doc right there. But we figured, hey, people want to be able to bring in a bunch at once. So the way we have this split up, so again, that feature template was just a base. It's important to start with a base, but make sure that base is flexible and customizable for each project. So for this project, we have a review section, a product section, a product V1 section, a product V2 section, because we actually iterated on it. Oh, it looks like Marvel's down. That's fun. And then we have an engineering section, testing, release, and we even added a future section, like future ideas for this feature. So I'll kind of quickly walk you through the steps that we take. Again, we have this review section, and this is just at the beginning of each project, we say, here are the reviews that we want to make sure we do for this process, and then we just check them off once we do it. So we've done a design review for this project, actually 3 times for this project. We've done a spec review, which is that more detailed design documentation that I got to do. And then we have the engineering plan review. Once the actual development work is like nearing completion, I'll do a fit and finish review, just make sure that the features look like the original designs. Then the next step, which we haven't gotten to yet, is release, and then we'll do a postmortem after 2 weeks. So that's our high-level reviews. We then get into our product goals, as Joshua was saying, like never do design work without having clear goals. So we have these goals listed out. We actually cut one of those. We have a list of possible scenarios, and then we have the actual product stuff. So this is kind of the first iteration of the product work. This is a survey feedback that I put in here. I would wish I had listened to that survey talk earlier, but anyways. Next, we actually, based on that survey, we realized, okay, we need to iterate. So now we have this V2 section. If we didn't do a user interviews or usability testing process for this particular project, but if I did, I could add in a bunch of kind of like Carola was showing, list cards and then jot things down and take notes, that kind of stuff, but we don't need that for this. So I'll go ahead and delete that. So this is actually just all the designs exported directly from Sketch, and we have it laid out here so the team can see it. I wish Marvel was, that's unfortunate. But anyways, that's a prototype. So we mix between Marvel and Figma and InVision. For this project, I did Marvel. So you can actually click on the prototype there. And what's helpful is that having the prototype clickable right there, right next to all the details in the spec, is really helpful for the engineering team to be able to oh, okay, I know exactly what that part of the spec is talking about. So again, new terminology, very helpful to have that right up front for your team to understand. I then go into the details on the how users use this feature, what is all the edge cases of the feature, any engineering considerations that I foresee, analytics, onboarding considerations, all that kind of stuff, detailing all that stuff out. We had to make changes to our privacy policy, so I even put that in here, and we had to submit our app to the Google for review, and then we actually have the engineering documentation. This is a whole separate talk. I won't go into this, but you can see we have our documentation and the estimates of how long this project would take. And then, it kind of gets to the point where, okay, we've pretty much fully tested this feature. We're waiting on a few other features to actually release this, but it'll be coming soon. So you can see here that having all this stuff side by side directly draws into that thing of accessibility of information, making sure that everything is kind of at your fingertips, and then also the kind of inclusivity into the design process. At every part of these phase separations, so we have product V1, product V2, I did a design review with my team and I got their input, and that's why they're kind of separated out a little bit. So it's been very helpful to get their input, make sure that they're involved and really bought into this. All right. So let's see if I can make my way back now. Keynote, where is it? Up, down, down. All right. Oh no. Come on, go away. These are some backup videos. So anyways, again, I really did want to just make sure that I didn't want to go through what a high-level design process looks like, because I think that's something that you can read online quite easily. But it's these specific tips about how do you make sure you work well with your team. Those are something that I haven't read. I've just experienced, in my career and seen successes and failures. And so I hope I can, I hope some of that rubs off onto you and kind of I pass that on. So thank you very much. Purple, we're in a free public beta. We're keeping it free for a little while to get more and more teams signed up and everything. So if this looked interesting, I would love for you to sign up and try it out and send me feedback or anything that you would like, any feature requests, that kind of stuff. Separately, if you have any other questions I can help with around your design process or making sure you work well with teams or even VR, I'm very active on Twitter. Tweet at me there or email me there. So thank you very much, everyone.
Awesome. Any questions? Oh, back there. Gotta pass the mic.
Hi, I know you mentioned that you usually share videos of user research with key stakeholders. One of the challenges in my organization is that we're not, even if we do that, the files are really long. So it's usually stakeholders don't usually take a look at those. So what tips would you have to go about with a scenario like that?
Sure. So one thing I did in a past usability test is I had a stopwatch. At the same time I start the video camera, I would start my stopwatch. And anytime, I think on my phone, just the countdown or the stopwatch on the phone, because you can hit lap and see the timestamp your video. So I timestamped my video that way, and then I went back and just clipped those segments out, and then shared only those segments and kind of clipped those segments together. There are some startups working on something that allows you to do that very easily rather than all this manual process, but that's what I recommend. Show video clips only. Never show the full video.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for tonight, unless, well, we have one more question back there, and that will be the closing. Get it? There we go. Yes. Awesome.
Thanks, Chris. I've been looking at Purple.pm for a little bit, and it looks very awesome. I think one of the questions that is a challenge with adoption of your tool, and just the struggle that I'm experiencing with my team is what are all the tools that a company uses, and how do you log into them, and how do you access them? And I think that's ultimately the question with your tool is the note-taking doc that we use isn't supported by your tool because we don't use Google Drive. And so that's the barrier for me to use it, but also with our team, I maybe put notes in Figma, and my developers put notes in Paper, and then we manage tasks in Rike, which is a not commonly used task management software. So how do you deal with that, and when do you force people to switch to the tools that work well with your process versus letting them do whatever they want?
Gotcha. Two separate questions. What do you do about, with Purple specifically, and if we don't support your tool, that kind of stuff? In general, first of all, send a feature request if there's an integration that we're missing. Sometimes it's very easy for us to integrate. But in other cases, then that's why we do have the ability to actually write full documents in Purple. And we're kind of left at the point where we say, all right, well, then you switch over and see the value of having it all together. So hopefully that answers your first question. The second question is more about how do you, at what point do you force the rest of your team to switch over to a new tool? I had a bad experience with this at Imager where we were testing out Pivotal Tracker to use on the engineering team. People didn't like it, and then I was tasked with looking at alternatives and switching. I got very busy and I forgot about just getting that done. And at the end of the day, there was an email sent out to all the engineering team being hey, here's a survey, riot, yeah, rah, rah. And I was oh my gosh, I totally forgot and I need to actually get on this. So you definitely want to make sure that you are, any good designer should be doing, talk to your users. So if you're going to be forcing people to switch to something, then make sure you're talking to them frequently and getting their feedback, that kind of stuff. So it's one of those things where make sure you put in the time, not just for yourself to learn the tool, but make sure you put in the time for everyone else to learn to use the tool and be comfortable with it. And oftentimes it's helpful that all these SaaS tool companies, they have salespeople to come to your company and specifically, train the team, that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
You want to set up a demo tomorrow at 5?
Yeah, just.
No, that's awesome. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Awesome. High five. Wait, high five. Yes.